Every Tuesday, we focus our attention on stories from the continent. We try and give you an update on those that dominate headlines in our feature Eye on Africa. So, from the resurgence of Boko Haram in Nigeria to uncertainty about upcoming elections in the DRC, and now the legal tussle between Britain and Mauritius. The first, by the way, the first time countries have taken each other to court over land possessions. So, we've certainly had our pick to choose from. But tonight, we're focusing on Uganda, Ethiopia and the China-Africa summit that wrapped up in Beijing earlier today. We're joined by international relations lecturer from the University of Cape Town, Xichavo Ndlovu. Good evening to you and thank you for talking to us here on Eye on Africa. Let's start with Uganda, the political crisis there. We've seen, of course, in recent years, President Museveni's growing authoritarianism in a country that really has weak institutions that allow it. Xichavo, are you hearing me?
I couldn't hear your last few sentences, but I think I heard you saying it has weak institutions. I think that was about
Yes, I was saying, can you explain what we've seen as growing authoritarianism by President Museveni and the fact that Uganda now has very weak institutions to fight him?
Yes. However, we are seeing, of course, the youth rising up to challenge, his rule. Recently, I think a lot of people have been on Twitter, following the hashtag Free Bobi Wine, and I think that is one example where young people are getting impatient and obviously supporting the younger candidates with the hope that hopefully the president of Uganda might end up stepping down. So I think the challenge is still there. Of course, the president has been in power since 1986, but we know that a lot of the youth, that is, the electorate currently was not, they only know Museveni as their only president, and they are becoming, very impatient, and therefore now we see that there's a support, for the new a young MP to even maybe stand for elections in 2021. So I really think that there is hope, but we can see that the government is obviously not taking this very lightly. We have heard about social media attacks. We have heard, about the arrest of various people. So the government will obviously not take it lightly, but I believe that there is a lot of pressure and that the president is starting to listen.
Well, it's one thing, of course, to disagree with an authoritarian figure like Museveni on Twitter, for example, but the country is facing real problems. You've got the refugee crisis, people coming down from South Sudan. You've got a youth bulge, even though they're unhappy, they are certainly restless. The economy is stagnant, jobs are scarce. They've got a myriad of problems in Uganda, do they not?
Yes, they have a lot of problems, of course, but if you look historically, what has happened is that with the rise of new media and social media, the solution to these problems is not only found internally. I mean, when you try to put pressure on government, it is not always successful when only done domestically. So what we see with these new movements and the use of new social, the new media is that what we are seeing is other countries, neighboring countries can also, be able to put that pressure as well. Because we have been seeing that, for example, Kenya, some of these tweets have been coming from Kenya, from Burundi, from Tanzania, which means it's more of a concerted effort in the East African region to actually see change. Because you have been talking about the refugee crisis. This is not necessarily just a domestic problem. It is a problem that also has to be solved with the government of Sudan. So just to say that it's not enough, of course, social media is not enough, but to make it more of a regional crisis and the involvement of other people in other countries trying to understand the political realities of a country like Uganda certainly, I think, puts impetus on a situation like that.
Well, you've mentioned, of course, Bobi Wine, who is, I suppose, the face of that pushback against Museveni. But we're still seeing some level of repression in terms of the arrest, the release and re-arrest of this MP politician, Robert Kyagulanyi is his actual name, but known as Bobi Wine. Can you tell our viewers exactly what happened there at that rally where he was supporting a rival candidate and had his bodyguards shot, no less?
Yes, I mean, the ruling government claimed that, you know, stones were thrown at the president's motorcade, and therefore it was more of protecting that motorcade, and there were stray bullets, of course, one of them hitting his driver, and he died at the scene. So that is what triggered it, but certainly some speculations are that perhaps it wasn't necessarily a mistake, and of course Bobby claimed on his tweet that maybe it is a bullet that had missed him. But we know that initially when he got arrested, he was charged on, you know, the possession of illegal firearms, but we know that that was also changed or dropped, and then the next charge was treason, which is very serious. He is currently out on bail, and we can say that the pressure has come not only from just East Africa, but even, you know, prominent musicians internationally, countries like the Netherlands, Canada, also taking part in this. So you can tell that even though Museveni has been in power for more than 30 years, he's starting to feel the threat. And I think Bobby, we should put him in context. It's not necessarily the figure that is Bobby, but more or less what he represents. And I believe that he represents the young electorate, and these are the new people that will be voting in 2021. So I believe that if we put him in that context of actually representing, you know, a country that has one of the youngest you know, people in the world, then we can understand the kind of threat that he actually poses.
All right, let's go to Ethiopia now. We've seen some reforms happening there. There's been a shake-up of the security services. We've seen that nationwide state of emergency ended, and the most encouraging part of all of that is, of course, peaceful relations with the arch nemesis Eritrea.
Yeah, Ethiopia is obviously such a stark contrast, right, to Uganda, because obviously of having a much younger prime minister, perhaps what the Ugandans are dreaming about. Well, following the resignation of the former prime minister in February this year, we have the new one. President or Prime Minister Ali is there right now, very, very young, capable, charismatic, and very credible as well. And I think that him, you know, announcing that there is no longer a war between Eritrea and Ethiopia was such an amazing thing. And I think for me to see people waiting on the other side in Eritrea at the airport, hoping, of course, not all of them got to see their relatives, but the fact that people have been separated for years, you know, out of course, it wasn't a choice, but because of the conflict between these two countries, I think it's an amazing sight to see. And I think the president has, of course, started very well. And I think there is hope, gives hope to that region specifically. But of course, he's meeting challenges along the way, especially with, you know, the conflict in the Somali region. So there is more that the president needs to do, and he's inheriting a history that is full of complexities. So it will be interesting to see how he leads and takes charge, and perhaps, you know, get rid of the draconian laws that have ruled this country for many decades.
He, of course, seems to have been the game changer in this situation, but can peace with Eritrea hold?
I believe that it can. I believe that it can. And I think, but first of all, I mean, Ethiopia also has issues to deal with right now domestically. I've just mentioned that there is ongoing conflict in the Somali region, meaning the president right now is very preoccupied. But at the same time, we should not take that for granted, because having seen that he has allowed the relations negotiations to start between Ethiopia and Eritrea is a very big step. And of course, how that pans out in the coming years will depend on both countries' leaders. So it's not absolutely up to him. But I think he does need a lot of support, especially to relieve the pressure that is happening internally as he seeks, to rule a federal state that is divided mainly along ethno-linguistic lines. And I think that is a big challenge.
Right, this feature, of course, as you know, is Eye on Africa, but to Beijing we go now, where we look at the China-Africa summit that got wrapped up today. The word coming out of that, certainly from the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, is that the offers for $60 billion in investment by China to the African continent, he's saying it's not a new form of colonialism.
Yes, I think the statement from our president is quite an important one, because China, people, experts and analysts have commented that China's involvement in Africa is a form of neo-colonialism, and many say it remains to be seen how different this is, from the colonialism of the European powers such as Britain. So China, of course, is out in Africa investing in a lot of infrastructural projects and looking for new markets as well, tapping into the resources, the resource-rich African continent. But I think we should not, obviously, as Africa and as African leaders, just sit back and say, well, here is an investment of 60 billion, and this is amazing. I think there is still room to actually engage in terms of how is this infrastructure going to benefit the region. Historically, Africa is a region that has struggled, of course, with issues of regional integration, and currently we are focusing on the new free trade area agreement. So there is a lot going on, and what are China's intention with this infrastructure massive, the One Road, One Belt initiative is also, of course, ongoing. So therefore, African countries actually need to ask the question of how are they going to benefit individually as well as holistically when they have actually historically struggled to gain economic benefits even through their own regional integration initiatives in Africa, your SADC, your ECOWAS. So I think there's a lot that remains to be seen in terms of what China, can bring with this new investment. Yeah. But I believe that African countries still need to continue asking the questions so that we do not go back to a situation where we are still, not actively engaging but receiving aid or perhaps investment that doesn't necessarily trickle down to the people on the ground.
Well, here's the other problem. Of course, part of the criticism about it being a new form of colonialism is that many of these countries that could be receiving this assistance may not necessarily be able to pay it back. And what happens in that instance? Can then Beijing put pressure to bear and in some way start making decisions for the countries that can't pay back the money? That's the concern, isn't it?
Certainly, that is very concerning, because, you are now taking the power away from the state and giving it to another state. So, the issue of debt is not new. Africa has experienced, periods of a debt crisis. African states have gone to institutions such as the IMF when to seek loans when they're in trouble. So, yes, of course, it is concerning that this kind of project, and this kind of investment will put a lot of African states into debt. And the question remains as to how they will be able to pay back this money. And I do not think that the solution is to give the power to Beijing, because African states, I believe, are still responsible for the kinds of decisions that they make about the development of their nations.
Final question to you. President Ramaphosa today in that post-conference press briefing paid particular attention to China's non-interference. And I was curious in terms of contrasting that with, for example, a human rights-oriented foreign policy that's always underpinned Western engagement with other countries. Is that a good thing, or might it be a bad thing when it comes to issues like human rights?
Yeah, that is a very difficult question, because I don't think the answer is that clear-cut. I mean, of course, the West approach has limited many African countries from receiving much needed funding to boost their development. And one cannot also say that China's policy of non-interference is necessarily the best one, especially for nations that have conflict, or for countries that still have dictators, or countries that lack, strong democratic institutions. So I think it's not a clear-cut answer. I think one thing that is, of course, obvious is that Africa does need the investment for its growing population. Africa does need this kind of investment to grow its economy. But at the same time, I think we should not ignore the abuse of human rights. And I think that's where African countries should challenge themselves to say, even though China has a policy of non-interference, it is still the responsibility of the state and our leaders to make sure that our constitutional rights are protected. So therefore, I think this is not a question that should be left to China's policy of non-interference, because that is a policy that they implement for their own interest. The question should be, when African countries find themselves in those kinds of situations, what can they do? And of course, if they leave the funding from the West, it means that they are not obviously subjected, to the rules about being transparent and obviously respecting human rights. But I think to make it just a yes/no answer is not helpful, but to actually look at the complexities of it and to say that how do we actually hold our leaders accountable domestically as well, without having to rely on external forces.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your analysis and your perspectives. Xichavo Ndlovu there, International Relations Lecturer from the University of Cape Town.